Hi guys, how's it going? It's Since the Skeleton here. Be sure to like and subscribe, and don't forget to hit the notification bell for more content. Thanks! Today we are getting back into dealing with dragons, once again, by Patricia C. Reed. Chapter 10, in which Cymrine and Alianora conduct some tests and disturb a wizard. Back in the kitchen, Cymrine and Alianora quickly determined that the fireproofing spell had indeed worked. First, Cymrine, then Alianora tossed a pinch of feverfew into the air and recited the spell verse. Then put a hand into a candle flame and held it there. Neither was burned at all, though Alianora claimed that the candle tickled almost as much as the eagle feather had done.
How long does the spell last?
Alianora asked. I'm not sure exactly, Cymrine said. At least an hour, but I'll have to do some tests to pin down beyond that point. To pin it down beyond that, I hope Kazul gets back soon. I want to see if it works with Dragonfire.
You're going to have Kazul breathe fire at you just to see if the spell works?
Alianora said, horrified.
What if it doesn't?
Then I'll talk to Kazul and we'll go see Morwen, and the three of us will try to figure out what to change to make the spell work for Dragonfire too. Don't look at me like that. I'm not going to stand in front of Kazul and have her breathe fire at me. I'll just stick out a finger, the way we did with the candle. This was not enough to convince Alianora, but Cymrine was determined. The whole point of trying this spell was to make ourselves immune to Dragonfire, she said. If it doesn't work, I don't want to find out for the first time when one of Kazul's guests gets mad and breathes fire at me just because... Let's retry that. This was not enough to convince Alianora, but Cymrine was determined. The whole point of trying the spell was to make ourselves immune to Dragonfire, she said. If it doesn't work, I don't want to find out for the first time when one of Kazul's guests gets mad and breathes fire at me just because he doesn't like the way I cooked his I am tongue-tied today. The whole point of trying the spell was to make ourselves immune to Dragonfire, she said. If it doesn't work, I don't want to find out for the first time when one of Kazul's guests gets mad and breathes fire at me because he doesn't like the way I cooked his cherries Jubilee. Alianora had to admit that this was a good point, but she was still disposed to argue. The discussion was cut short by Kazul's return. At first, the dragon was more inclined to agree with Alianora than with Cymrine, but after Cymrine proved her invulnerability to candle flames, lighted torches, and the fire she built in the kitchen stove, Kazul agreed to the trial. She insisted, however, on working up to full power in gradual stages, and Cymrine was forced to agree. Before they began, Cymrine threw another pinch of feverfew into the air and recited the couplet again, just to be sure the spell wouldn't wear off in the middle of the test. Then Kazul lowered her head nearly to the ground, and Alianora watched nervously as Cymrine lowered her hand slowly into various intensities of dragonflame. Finally, Cymrine stood right in front of Kazul while the dragon breathed her hottest. The spell worked perfectly every time. There, Cymrine said when Kazul stopped at last. Now we know it works. Aren't you glad?
I'm glad,
Alianora said fervently.
And I hope I never have to watch anything like that again as long as I live. I didn't dare blink for fear you'd go up in smoke while my eyes were closed.
Why don't you try it yourself? Cymrine said mischievously. No!
Watching you was, said Alianora and Kazul together. Watching you was bad enough, Alianora went on with a shudder. I believe it works. I don't see any reason for me to test it.
Besides, I've done more than enough fire breathing for one day, Kazul added. I'm starting to get overheated.
All right, if you don't want to, you don't have to, Cimmerian said. If we're all done, I'd better go tidy up. Alienora stayed to help Cimmerian finish cleaning up the traces of the spell, by which time she had calmed down considerably and was very nearly her usual self. Before she left and made her usual self again, Cimmerian gave her a pouch full of dried feverfew before she left and made her recite the words that activated the spell several times to make sure she had memorized them correctly. Remember, you only have to repeat the first half of the verse to get the spell going. Now that it's been set up, Cimmerian said. Can you do it? It's only 2 lines and they rhyme, Alienora said, laughing. How could I forget that? My memory isn't that bad. Maybe not, but say anyway, Cimmerian said. Alienora laughed again and did so. At last, she set off into the tunnels, and Cimmerian went back to the main cave to see what Kazul and Roxem had found out about the Caves of Fire and Night. Kazul was somewhat out of temper, and Cimmerian thought privately that she had been telling the truth about getting overheated. Rather than annoy the dragon further, Cimmerian asked if she could read the book Kazul had borrowed from Morwen. It's in the treasure room, Kazul said. Read it there, and I hope you see something in it that we didn't. Cimmerian nodded and picked up her lamp, and hurried off before Kazul could change her mind. The book was lying near a pile of sapphires next to an ornate gold crown. She picked it up and went over to the table, which is large and very sturdy because it was intended for counting piles of gold and silver coins, and sat down to read. It was even drier and duller than Kazul had said. There were a great many mayhaps and perchances and wherefores strung together in long involved sentences that compared the strange and wonderful things in the caves to obscure philosophical ideas and odd customs from the places Cimmerian had never heard of. After a few pages, Cimmerian put the book down and went and got a quill pen, an ink pot, and some paper, so that she could write down the things she thought were important. She didn't want to have to read A Journey Through the Caves of Fire and Night more than once. For the next 3 days, Cimmerian spent bits of her spare time in the treasure room, taking notes on the De Montmorency. It took her that long because she could never manage to read for more than a little while without getting so bored that she nearly fell asleep. Her persistence gained her several pages of notes about the caves, but nothing that seemed as if it might be of particular interest to wizards. Alienora came to see her a few days later, looking very cheerful. It worked, she announced as she came into the library where Cimmerian was going over her notes. Cyrodiil Dwell's gone. Thranduil rescued her, just the way you said he would. Good, Cimmerian said. I'm glad something is going right. What's the problem? Alienora asked, seating herself on the other side of the table from Cimmerian. This, Cimmerian said. She waved at the paper-covered table. Kazul is sure that the key to what the wizards are after is somewhere in that dreaded book she borrowed from Morwen. I copied out everything that looked interesting, but none of it seems like anything a wizard would care about. How do you know that? Alienora asked curiously. I don't, Cimmerian said. I'm just guessing. That's the problem. Oh! Alienora picked up the sheet of paper nearest her and frowned. What on earth does this mean? Cimmerian looked at the page Alienora was holding. Thus these caves of fire and night are, in some sense, indivisible, whereas the caves of chance are, by contrast, individual. Though it is preposterous to claim that these descriptions are true of either group of caves in their entirety. That's one of the bits I copied word for word. The whole book is like that. I think it means that if you have a piece of something magical from the Caves of Fire and Night, you can use it in a spell as if it were the whole thing. I can see why you wouldn't be sure, Alienora said. Do you think it would help you figure things out if you stopped for a while? I have stopped, Cimmerian pointed out. Or did you have something more specific in mind? I'm almost out of feverfew, Eleonora said, looking down at the table. I was hoping you'd come with me to pick some more. You're almost out? Simrine said in surprise. How did that happen? Eleonora shifted uncomfortably. I've been working that fireproof spell every hour or so for the past 2 days, she admitted. Warog's been getting more and more unpredictable, and I don't feel comfortable otherwise. Helena was visiting yesterday when he came in the middle of the afternoon, and he was roaring and dripping little bits of flame when he breathed. She was terrified, and I don't blame her. If it weren't for the spell, I'd be scared to death. What's the matter with him? I don't know. He doesn't tell me anything about dragon politics or wizards or what he's been getting so worked up about. He's not like Kazul. Simrine frowned, considering. Maybe Kazul will have some idea what's bothering him. Ask her this evening in the meantime. Let's go get that feverfew. You're right to say that I could use a break. Oh, good, said Eleonora in tones of considerable relief. I've never picked herbs before, and I'm not sure what feverfew looks like. I don't know what I'd have done if you'd said you wouldn't come. Simrine put her notes away and got 2 wicker baskets and a small knife from one of the storage rooms. Up or down? Eleonora asked when they left the cave. Up. The other way, Simrine said. The other way is the ledge I told you about, and I wouldn't be surprised if bits of it were still invisible. The path through the pass of silver ice twisted and turned past the openings of other dragons' caves. Most of the rocks around the caves had scorch marks, and Simrine and Eleonora didn't see much growing among them. At this rate, we'll have to go nearly all the way to the enchanted forest to find any grass, much less herbs. Wait a minute, Simrine said. Look over there. Through that crack in the rocks. Doesn't that look like something green? Eleonora's eyes followed Simrine's pointing finger. Yes, she said without enthusiasm. It looks green. The rock Simrine had indicated was a large boulder at the bottom of a steep slope. The slope was covered with gravel and looked as if it would be impossible to climb down without skinning a knee or an elbow at the very least. The boulder itself was in 2 pieces, with just enough space between them for someone to squeeze through, provided the someone was not very large. Come on, let's get a better look, said Simrine. She walked to the edge of the slope and wrapped her skirts tightly around her legs. Then she sat down with her basket in her lap and slid down the slope, raising an enormous cloud of dust and sounding like an avalanche in process. She reached the bottom in safety and stood up, brushing at her skirt. The dust was so thick that she could hardly see, and when she tried to call to Eleonora, she coughed so hard she could barely speak. Simrine, are you all right? It's just the dust, Simrine said in a muffled voice. She had taken out a handkerchief and put it over her mouth and nose to keep the dust out. Wasn't perfect, but it helped a great deal. Come on, it's your turn. Are you sure we shouldn't just go around? Stop stalling, it's not that bad. That's what you say, Eleonora muttered, but she wrapped her skirts around her, clutched her basket, and slid down the slope. She made even more noise than Simrine had. When she got to the bottom, she was coughing and choking. Simrine handed her the handkerchief, and they waited for a moment while the dust settled. Crawling through the sweat boulder was easier than they expected. The crevice was wider than it had looked from the path, and the bottom of the crack was so full of dust and gravel and dead leaves that it was almost flat. Simrine and Eleonora had to walk single file, and there were 1 or 2 spots they had to turn sideways in order to get through, but it was not really difficult. On the other side of the garden, the 2 girls found a lush green valley. It was bowl-shaped and not very large, but flowers and grasses stood waist-high between the random clumps of bushes that dotted the valley floor. A squirrel, which had been sunning itself on the ledge near the entrance, leapt
leaped for a small tree as Cimmerian and Alienora appeared.
My goodness, Alienora said, looking around with wide eyes. This place looks as if no one but us has ever been here before. There aren't even any scorch marks on the rocks.
Cimmerian blinked. Alienora was right. Lichens covered the weathered gray rocks that rose above the valley, and small plants grew in cracks and crevices that showed no signs of the touch of dragonfire. That's odd, Cimmerian commented.
Why?
Alienora asked. Those mountains aren't tall enough to keep dragons from flying over, and they're right in the middle of the dragon's territory, so why haven't the dragons been here? They usually keep a close eye on everything that belongs to them.
Maybe they have been here, but they never found anything to breathe fire at,
Alienora said. Well, I'm going to ask Kazul about it when I get back, Cimmerian said, as she waded through the grass. Why don't you take that side, and I'll look over here. We'll cover more ground that way.
First, you'd better show me what I'm looking for, Alienora said apologetically. I'm afraid I couldn't tell Feverfew from Carrots if there was a dragon chasing me and my life depended on it.
Cimmerian nodded and they started off. They had not gone far when she saw a patch of white button-shaped flowers she was looking for. Here, she said, showing them to Alienora. This is Feverfew. The younger plants are the best, the ones that haven't blossomed yet. Alienora studied the leaves and flowers with care.
I think I'll recognize it now.
They cut some of the plants, leaving those that were blooming. You find the next patch, Cimmerian said as they started off again.
Let's try over there,
Alienora said, pointing. They found several more patches of feverfew, and gradually their baskets began to fill. I think this should be enough, Cimmerian said at last. Unless you think...
Cimmerian!
Alienora hissed, clutching at Cimmerian's arm.
There's someone behind that bush!
Cimmerian turned. A dark line snaked through the grass, where something large had bent and broken the plants in passing. You're right, she said, and started forward. Alienora hung back, still holding Cimmerian's arm.
You're not going to look, are you?
How else are we going to find out who it is? Cimmerian asked reasonably. She shook off Alienora's hand. Quietly, she walked over the clump of bushes and peered around it. Alienora followed with evident reluctance. A man in blue and brown silk robes was crouched on the other side of the bush, with his back toward Cimmerian. He was stuffing saw-edged purple leaves into a small linen bag the size of Cimmerian's hand. His hair was brown, and on the ground beside him lay a long, polished staff.
Anturel?
Cimmerian said in surprise. The man snatched up his staff, straightened as if a bee had just stung him. It was indeed Anturel, and he did not look at all pleased to see her. He stuffed the linen bag quickly into his sleeve and said, "But Princess Cimmerian, what brings you here?" "I was about to ask you the same thing," Cimmerian said. "Wizards go where they wish, answering to no one," Anturel said, waving his free hand in a lofty manner. "Maybe outside the Mountains of Mourning they do, but around here they have to check with the dragons first," Cimmerian said. "You know nothing of the matter," Anturel said, looking very put out.
Cimmerian?
And Alienora's tone was doubtful.
Do you know this person?
"I'm sorry, I should have introduced you. This is Anturel, one of the wizards I told you about. Anturel, this is Princess Alienora of the Duchy of Tor-on-Marsh. At the moment, she's the Princess of Dragon Warog." Alienora curtsied, murmured something polite and inaudible. Anturel, who had stiffened in surprise when he realized that Cimmerian was not alone, relaxed visibly. "Princess Warog? That's all right, then. Though he really shouldn't have sent you."
"But Warog didn't..." "Ow!"
said Alienora. The owl was because Cimmerian had hastily kicked her ankle to keep her from telling Anturel too much. "Didn't what?" Anturel asked, frowning suspiciously. "Didn't know you were gonna be here," Cimmerian said. "Well, of course he didn't know," Anturel said, looking annoyed. "That's the whole point, after all." Cimmerian would have much liked to ask him what the point was, but she was afraid it would make him suspicious again.
I don't understand, she said, instead batting her eyes at him.
Of course not, Antorel replied in a condescending tone that made Simrine's teeth hurt. But it doesn't matter, I'm not annoyed with you.
I'm so glad, Simrine murmured.
Antorel gave her an oily smile. In fact, there's no need for you to tell Warog you met me here.
I wouldn't dream of it, Simrine said with perfect truth.
Excellent. Then may I escort the two of you back to the path?
Eleanor looked hopeful in Simrine's direction. But we can't leave yet, Simrine said, opening her eyes very wide. We haven't picked any cornflowers or daisies.
Behind her, she heard Eleanor make a smothered choking noise, as if she were trying very hard not to laugh. Daisies, Antorel said in a flat, incredulous tone. You want to stay and pick daisies? Simrine nodded vigorously.
And cornflowers and flax and all sorts of things, she said, waving her hand at the flowers blooming all around. They'll look so pretty in a bowl of water in the kitchen.
I'm sure you're right, Antorel said. He looked as if he would have liked to object, but couldn't think of anything to object to. Perhaps I could help you, he said reluctantly.
Oh, we wouldn't dream of keeping you, Simrine said.
Antorel was clearly reluctant to leave the two girls in the valley, but Simrine did not give him much choice. After another minute or so of conversation, the wizard was forced to go. He did not use a vanishing spell, but trudged away on foot. Simrine watched him until he was out of sight among the bushes, wondering whether he had some special reason not to use spells in the valley, or whether he simply didn't know the right spells to make him vanish.
That's a relief, Eleanor said. Why did you insist on staying when it was so obvious he wanted us to leave? I was afraid he was going to turn us into toads or something.
I wanted to see what he was up to, Simrine said, and I don't think Antorel is a very good wizard. He probably couldn't manage anything worse than a squirrel. Eleanor did not appear to find this very reassuring. Simrine checked to make sure Antorel was out of sight, then went over to the place where he had been standing when she peered around the bush. At first, she did not notice anything unusual. Then she saw a purplish plant oozing sap from places where several of its spiky sawtoothed leaves had been broken off.
Look at this. What is it? Eleanor asked.
I don't know, Simrine said absently. I saw a couple of other plants like this while we were picking feverfew, but I thought they were just weeds.
Maybe it is a weed.
A wizard wouldn't be breaking into the dragon section of the Mountains of Mourning just to pick weeds. They don't even use herbs or to cast spells, so what does Antorel want with this prickly-looking thing? Eleanor shrugged.
Maybe he needs it for something he can't do with magic.
I wonder what that would be. Simrine reached out and carefully broke off a spray of leaves. She wrapped them in her handkerchief and put the packet in her pocket. Let's see if we can find out whether he picked anything else. Antorel had left a dark trail of bent and broken plants to mark the way he had come, so his path was easy to follow. Simrine and Eleanor searched carefully along it for some way, looking for signs that the wizard had picked other herbs, but neither of them saw any.
I don't think there's anything to find,
Eleanor said, pushing her apricot-colored hair out of her face.
And it's getting awfully warm.
Have you noticed that there aren't any of those purple plants along here? I bet that was all he wanted.
Then let's leave before that wizard thinks to circle around to check on what we're doing, Eleanor urged.
Simrine doubted that Antorel would think of doing such a thing, but she nodded in agreement, and the two girls left the valley. Eleanor was quiet and thoughtful for most of the walk back to Kazul's cave. Simrine was grateful for her silence. She had a lot to think about herself, and from what Antorel had said, it seems likely that Warog was helping the wizard somehow, or at least that he had known that Antorel was looking for that he had known what Antarel was looking for in the little valley. Simrine found it difficult to imagine a dragon helping a wizard, but she couldn't say with certainty that it was impossible. And if Warog was involved with Antarel, Zeminar, it might explain why he had been so touchy lately. When they arrived back at the cave, Simrine shook herself free of her preoccupation. She and Alienora unloaded their baskets and tied the herbs in bunches to hang in the dark corner of the kitchen to dry.
How long will it be before I can use the feverfew? Alienora asked worriedly.
I'm not sure, Simrine said in a considering tone. It'll take at least a week to dry thoroughly, but you might be able to use it in the spell before then. The directions didn't say how dry the feverfew has to be. We could try it every day in a pinch of leaves from one of these bunches if you like. Alienora nodded. I really do need it. I wonder if it would work without being dried, Simrine said. She pulled a leaf from one of the hanging plants and shredded it carefully between her fingers, then tossed it up in the air and recited the rhyme. There, now light a candle or another lamp or something. Alienora had already lit a candle and set it on the table. Simrine moved over and stuck her finger in the flame. I think it's working, she said, and moved the rest of her hand closer. The sleeve of her dress caught fire. Simrine hastily pulled her hand away from the flame and slapped at from the candle and slapped at the flames, while Alienora snatched up a bucket of water from beside the sink and poured it over Simrine's arm. The fire went out, and so did the candle, and both Simrine and Alienora got thoroughly soaked.
Oh dear, Alienora said, ignoring her soggy skirts. Simrine, did you burn yourself?
No, Simrine said, looking at her arm with a puzzled expression. I didn't feel a thing. I thought the spell worked, but nothing caught fire when we tested it before.
It must be because the feverfew is fresh instead of dried. And I had hoped that I'd be able to use it right away.
If you're that low on dried feverfew, take some of mine, Simrine offered. Gazul's not particularly irritable. I only need to keep a pinch or two in case of emergencies.
Thank you,
Alienora said fervently, and Simrine turned her soggy cuffs back and went to get the bottled spices. And that is the end of chapter 10. I hope you all enjoyed and have a good night.